Welcome back to your channel, LeOo Story Land. Here we uncover real Reddit stories. If you liked my video, please like, share, subscribe.
"You don't really use that room anyway, Gary." That's what she said. Standing in my garage on a Sunday morning, not even sitting down first. Not even saying hello, just walked straight to it like she'd rehearsed the line a dozen times on the drive over. And maybe she had. "My name is Gary Holloway. I'm 57 years old. I spent 28 years as a licensed electrician, built this house with my own hands on a lot I paid cash for back in 1996. And I've lived alone in it since my wife Carol passed 6 years ago. I'm not someone who gets loud when he's angry, but I know what I own, I know what it cost me, and I know the difference between someone asking for help and someone who's already decided the answer before the question leaves their mouth." It was a Sunday morning in early October. The kind of morning where the air has that sharp edge to it, but the sun hasn't figured out what season it is yet. I had the hood up on my '98 Silverado. Timing chain had been giving me trouble for weeks. And the old portable radio Carol gave me the Christmas before she got sick was sitting on the shelf above the workbench, playing something low. I keep it on that shelf. I don't move it. Some things you just leave where they belong. The garage door was open to the driveway. The maple out front had gone deep orange. My coffee was on the workbench going cold, and it was exactly the kind of quiet Sunday morning I'd built my retirement around. Nobody wanting anything, nowhere to be, just me and a problem I could solve with my hands. Then I heard tires on the gravel. Scott's car. A 2021 Jeep Grand Cherokee silver leased. I'd noticed that detail when he first pulled up in it last spring and said it was new. He'd changed the subject fast. I'd filed it away without saying anything. He came in through the open garage door with Lorraine right behind him. She had that look she always gets when she walks into a space scanning, cataloging, like she's doing a quiet inventory of everything in the room. Scott said, "Hey." He didn't quite meet my eyes. Lorraine smiled and said good morning, and then, before I'd even set down the socket wrench, she said it. "We just need the upstairs room, Gary. You don't really use it anyway." I set the wrench on the workbench, slowly. The upstairs room, Carol's sewing room, same curtains she picked out from a catalog in 2003, blue with small white flowers. Same chair she sat in every evening after dinner, the one with the worn armrest on the left side where she always rested her elbow. Same basket of fabric on the floor that I haven't touched in 6 years because I don't know what to do with it, and I'm not ready to find out. Lorraine had been in that room before. She knew what it was. She knew what it meant. I looked at Scott. He was studying the oil stains on the garage floor like they contained some kind of answer. "No," I said, one word, no explanation, no apology. Just no, and then I waited. Lorraine didn't argue, not directly, not right there. She pivoted. Said they just needed a place until things stabilized. That it wouldn't be long, that they weren't asking for much. Scott nodded along beside her, still not meeting my eyes, adding that it was just temporary, just a few months, just until the business found its footing again. I told them I was willing to help. Financially, a specific amount, a written agreement, real terms, and a timeline. I said I could give them something to get started and lend more if needed, but it would be a loan with paperwork, not a handshake. I told them they could find a place nearby that fit what they could actually afford right now, and I'd help them get there. What I would not do was hand over my house. Lorraine smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. Scott exhaled through his nose. They said they'd think about it and left 25 minutes after they arrived. I stood in the garage for a while after their car pulled out, listening to the radio, looking at nothing in particular. Then I went back to the timing chain. I figured that was the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, I was backing out of my driveway when Brenda Kowalski flagged me down from her mailbox 3 houses up. Brenda's a retired school teacher who's lived on this street longer than I have. She leaned toward my window with a warm smile and said, "Gary, it's just wonderful that Scott's moving back in. You won't be rattling around in that big house alone anymore." I kept my face neutral. "Where'd you hear that, Brenda?" She blinked. Well, Lorraine posted something in the neighborhood group, said they were excited to be close to family again. I thanked that I had an errand to run and drove to the hardware store on Route 9. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before I went inside. I pulled out my phone and found the Millbrook Neighbors Facebook group. Lorraine's post was near the top. So grateful to finally be getting settled near family. Can't wait to be close to home again. She'd tagged the neighborhood group, tagged Scott, tagged the street name. 47 likes. A string of comments from people I'd known for 15 and 20 years. "Congratulations, how wonderful, so happy for you. Gary must be thrilled." I read through every comment. She hadn't called me, she hadn't texted, she'd come to my garage, heard no, driven home, and told the whole neighborhood yes anyway. She wasn't confused. She wasn't optimistic. She was building a record, a public story that would make it harder for me to hold my ground without looking like the one who'd changed his mind. I put the phone in my pocket and went inside to buy what I came for. But something had shifted in how I was thinking about all of this. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in almost 2 years. I went through the boxes in the closet off the kitchen, the ones I'd packed up after Carol died and never fully dealt with. Old utility bills, appliance manuals, insurance papers she'd sorted and labeled in her neat handwriting. Carol kept everything. She had a system I never fully understood while she was alive. And afterward, I just put the boxes in the closet and closed the door. I wasn't looking for anything specific, I was just moving through things. The way you do when your mind is working on a problem and your hands need something to do. I found it in the second box, near the bottom, folded inside an old envelope. A piece of note-a-paper with Carol's handwriting at the top, Scott and Lorraine, October, and below it a simple handwritten agreement, $8,000. Dated 4 years ago, 3 months after the wedding. Lorraine's full signature at the bottom, Scott's initials beside hers, a line that read, to be repaid within 12 months. I sat at the kitchen table and held it under the overhead light. Carol had kept it, labeled it, filed it where it could be found. She didn't say anything to me about it at the time, didn't want to make it a thing between us all, same as me. But she'd written it down and put it somewhere safe, because Carol understood that the truth has a way of needing to show up eventually. She wanted it to be able to. 8,000 4 years ago. Not one payment, not one mention. I set the paper carefully on the table, smoothed the fold, and looked at it for a long time. Then I got up, poured a glass of water, and started thinking about who I needed to call. The first call was to Philip Durbin. We'd played on the same baseball team in high school, lost touch for years, reconnected at the Rotary about 8 years back, and stayed in contact. Philip has been a financial advisor for 31 years. I didn't ask him to look into anything officially. I just described the general situation, adult kid, struggling business, asking to move in, and said I was trying to understand the shape of what I was dealing with. Philip didn't need names. He told me what patterns he watches for when someone's finances are closer to the edge than they're letting on. Multiple revolving credit accounts sitting near their limits, lease agreements on vehicles that should have been purchases, business loans with no clear repayment structure. Spending that stays flat or keeps climbing while income is falling. He said when those things show up together, the fall isn't a future event, it's already happening in slow motion. People in that position often don't see how close they are to the bottom until the thing they were counting on to catch them isn't there. I thanked him and told him I'd see him at the next Rotary meeting. The second call was to Neil Carver. Neil runs the hardware store on Route 9, where I've been buying supplies for 20 years. I wasn't calling to ask him anything specific, just checking in, the way I do every few weeks. About halfway through the conversation, Neil mentioned almost as a side note that a woman had been in earlier that week asking about interior paint samples. Said she was thinking about refreshing a bedroom somewhere. He described her without realizing it meant anything. It was Lorraine. Neil had no idea what he'd just told me. He was just making conversation. But I knew exactly which bedroom she'd been mentally redecorating. The one with the blue curtains and the worn chair and the basket of fabric that hadn't been touched in 6 years. I thanked him and hung up. I went back to the kitchen table, poured myself a second cup of coffee.
Putting the pieces together. The picture was clear enough. The business had been sliding for a while, not a sudden collapse, a slow one. The kind people convince themselves they can outrun if they just hold on a little longer. The debt wasn't new. The leased car was a signal. The $8,000 had never been paid back because at some point they'd quietly decided it didn't need to be. And my house, specifically Carol's room, had already been claimed in their minds long before they ever pulled into my driveway that Sunday morning. I wasn't angry. Anger wasn't going to solve anything. What I needed was to think clearly and move carefully, the same way I would approach any job that had more going on behind the walls than what showed on the surface. They came back the following Saturday, no call ahead, same as before. This time Scott spoke first. He'd prepared. His voice was steadier than the last visit, more controlled, like he'd worked through the objections in his head on the drive over. He said they didn't have many good options, that a few months was genuinely all they needed, that family was supposed to help each other through hard times, that it wouldn't affect my routine. He hit every point in order, like a list he'd memorized. Lorraine stood beside him, not behind him this time, beside him, forward, like she'd given herself a promotion since the last visit. I asked them to come inside. We sat down at the kitchen table. I laid out what I was willing to do, same as before. Financial help with a written agreement, real terms, a real timeline documented properly, help finding a place nearby that fit what they could actually manage right now. I said it clearly and I didn't rush it. Then Lorraine leaned forward. Gary, you have more space in this house than you use in a month. We're not asking you to give anything up. It would just be one room. I looked at her steadily. It's not about the space, I said. It's about what the room is. She held my gaze. Carol's been gone 6 years. She would have wanted, don't, I said. Quietly, not sharp, not loud, just a single word with a wall behind it. She stopped. Scott looked at the table. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I got up, went to the counter, and came back with a folded piece of notepaper Carol had kept. I set it down in the center of the table between us and didn't say anything. Scott recognized her handwriting before he read a single word. I watched it register in his face, the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders dropped about half an inch. The $8,000 I said 4 years ago, I didn't push it because you were just starting out and I didn't want money to become a thing between us. But Carol kept the paper. Lorraine looked at it, then looked at me. Something behind her expression shifted, not guilt, more like a calculation being revised. I'm not asking for it back today, I continued, but I've already spoken to my attorney, Earl Stanton, about having this drawn up as a formal promissory note. It'll come through the mail, certified, return receipt required. That's not a negotiation, that's just me being clear about where things stand. Lorraine opened her mouth, and while we're being clear, I said, I've also been talking to Earl about the deed structure on this house, making sure everything is documented the way it should be. The room went quiet. Lorraine set her coffee cup down without drinking from it. Scott was looking at the table again, but differently this time, not avoiding my eyes, more like he was working something out in his head that he didn't have the words for yet. After a moment, Lorraine said they appreciated my time. Her voice was even controlled, the way someone sounds when they're deciding to cut their losses and regroup somewhere else. Scott nodded once. They were out the door in 10 minutes. I stood at the kitchen window and watched them back out of the driveway. Then I washed the cups, dried them, put them back in the cabinet, and called Earl Stanton to confirm our appointment for Monday morning. Earl's office is on Maple Street downtown, second floor of a building that used to be a savings and loan back in the 80s. Dark wood paneling, shelves of matching binders, a window that looks out over the street. The kind of place where things get decided quietly and stay decided. I'd sat across that desk from Earl 6 years ago when we handled Carol's estate. He doesn't use 3 sentences when one will do, which I've always respected. I had the house placed into a revocable living trust that Monday morning. Clear terms, defined conditions for any future transfer. No vague language, nothing that could be stretched into something it wasn't by someone motivated to try. Earl drafted the promissory note for the $8,000 the same week, properly formatted, dated, signed, and sent certified mail to Scott and Lorraine's address with a return receipt card. 2 days after that, I called my bank and quietly removed Scott from the emergency contact list on my accounts. No announcement, no explanation. Just a phone call, a confirmation, and a thank you to the woman who processed it. None of this required a confrontation. None of it required me to raise my voice or say anything dramatic. I had spent 28 years as an electrician. You learn early on that the work that holds the longest is the work nobody ever sees, the connections made right inside the walls, the load calculations done correctly the first time so you never have to tear it open and start over. That's how I handled this. One step done properly, then the next. The certified mail receipt came back, signed 4 days later. I put it in the same box where I'd found Carol's note. About 3 weeks after that, the listing showed up online. Scott and Lorraine's house, the one they'd bought 3 years ago in a neighborhood about 12 minutes from here. The listing photos were clean and staged, neutral furniture, careful angles that avoided anything too personal. The asking price told the real story. It was $22,000 below what county records showed they'd paid for it. I didn't react. I just looked at the number for a moment and let it settle the way numbers always do when you stop trying to make them say something different than what they are. The listing went pending 8 days after it hit the market. It closed 2 weeks after that. Scott sent me a text the morning of the closing. 2 words, "We're selling." I texted back, "Okay, you all right?" He didn't respond for a few hours. Then, that evening Lorraine's post went up on Facebook. Something about exciting new chapters and fresh starts. I read it once and put my phone down. About 6 weeks after the sale closed, Scott called on a Tuesday night. He told me Lorraine had moved out. Staying with her mother for now, he said. His voice had that flat, compressed quality that means someone is holding themselves together through effort, not falling apart. Just empty in the way you get when you've been running on fumes for a long time and the fumes finally run out. I said I was sorry to hear it. I meant it. He'd found a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of town, month-to-month lease. He said it wasn't much. I asked if it was paid for first month and deposit covered. He said yes. I told him that was the only thing that mattered right now. Not the size of the place, not what it looked like from the outside, just whether it was his and whether he could hold on to it. He said he'd taken a job doing tech repair for a regional service chain. Steady hours, decent pay, not what he'd imagined for himself at 31. I told him steady was worth more than it sounded right now, and I meant that too. There was a pause on the line. Then he said quietly, "I should have called you more. Before everything got this far." I told him the line was always open. That hadn't changed. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while without turning the TV on. Just the sound of the house settling the way old houses do at night. The refrigerator running, the occasional car passing outside. I thought about Scott at 31, sitting in an apartment he'd furnished on what he could afford, starting over without the safety net he thought he had. I didn't feel satisfied about it. I didn't feel vindicated. I just hoped he'd use the ground he was standing on now to build something that would actually hold. About 4 months after everything settled, Scott came by on a Sunday morning. I was in the garage, hood up on the Silverado. Same timing chain I'd been working on the day this all started. Carol's radio was on the shelf. The maple out front had leafed back out, full green now, the deep orange of October long gone. He came in through the open garage door and stopped for a second. Looking around the way you look at a place you haven't seen in a while and are trying to line up with how you remembered it. Then he spotted the old wooden stool in the corner, the one Carol used to pull up and sit on when she'd keep me company on weekend mornings. And he dragged it over and sat down. We talked for a while, his new job mostly, a recurring issue with the apartment's water heater that I walked him through over the phone with his landlord while he stood there listening. He asked about the Silverado. I told him it was getting there, easy conversation. The kind that doesn't require much effort on either side. The kind we hadn't had in a while. Then he got quiet. He was looking at the radio on the shelf when he said it. I thought you'd step in, Dad. When things were really going sideways, I kept thinking you'd eventually just step in and that would be that. I set the socket wrench down on the workbench and turned to look at him. I did step in, I said, just not the way you wanted. He sat with that for a moment. Nodded slowly, like he was turning it over. Lorraine kept saying you had more than enough, he said. That it didn't make sense for you to have all that space and not help when we needed it. I offered to help, I said, with money in writing on terms that were fair to both of us. That's help. I know what she was asking for wasn't help, I said. What she was asking for was your problem becoming my problem. Those aren't the same thing. He looked at his hands for a moment. Yeah, he said, I know that now. We worked on the truck for about an hour after that. He held pressing questions, didn't talk when I was concentrating. When we finished, I made us both a sandwich and we ate standing at the workbench the way I used to eat lunch on job sites for 28 years. No table, no ceremony. Just food and a few minutes off your feet. Before he left, he stopped in the driveway and stood there for a second with his keys in his hand looking at the front of the house. I'm going to start paying back the $8,000, he said, not because of the promissory note, just because it's right. I told him there was no rush, whenever he was ready. No, he said, I want to start now. Even if it's just a little each month, I want it on record. I looked at him standing there in the driveway, 31 years old, a little thinner than he used to be. The kind of tired that comes from rebuilding rather than just surviving. Something in how he said it, not asking permission, not looking for a reaction, just stating a fact, told me more than anything else that had happened over the past year. All right, I said, we'll keep track. He nodded, got in his car, and drove away. I stood at the end of the driveway and watched his taillights disappear around the corner at the end of the block. I didn't go inside right away. The evening had gone soft and still that particular fall quiet where the air has finally decided to stop pretending it's something warmer. The maple out front was holding the last of its leaves, a few drifting down into the yard every few minutes without any wind to explain it. The porch light was on, same fixture I wired myself the summer I finished the house. The summer Carol stood back from the front steps and said, Gary, I think we actually did it. I stood there and thought about her for a while, not with the sharp kind of grief that used to knock me sideways in the first years after she passed. More like the quiet version, the kind that just lives in the background now, steady and familiar, that surfaces when the evening gets still enough and you stop moving long enough to notice it. The kind that reminds you why certain things are worth protecting without needing to explain itself. She would have handled all of this differently. She would have sat at that kitchen table with Scott and Lorraine for 3 hours and found an angle I wouldn't have thought of, some way to help that felt warmer, that left everyone with a little more dignity. She was better at people than I ever was. She could read a room in about 30 seconds and figure out what everyone in it actually needed, which was almost never what they were asking for out loud. But she also kept that piece of paper. She wrote down the terms, got the signatures, folded it up, labeled it, and put it somewhere it could be found when it needed to be. Because she understood something I've come to believe more firmly the older I get, that loving someone and holding them accountable aren't opposites. They just look different from the outside depending on which one you happen to be watching at the time. I went back into the garage and reached up and turned off Carol's radio. The tools on the wall were in the order she'd put them. The last time she organized out here, about a month before she got too sick to be on her feet much. She'd labeled every hook with a strip of masking tape and a marker. Said I'd lose everything if she didn't. She was right. I'd never moved a single one. I looked around the garage for a moment, the truck, the workbench, the shelf, the radio that was quiet now, and then I turned off the overhead light and walked inside. The house was still paid off, in trust. Protected by documents that said clearly and permanently what it was and what it wasn't. Not a fallback for someone else's decisions. Not something to be divided up or spoken about in the neighborhood Facebook group as if it had already changed hands. Just a house built right on a foundation that wasn't going anywhere. I locked the door behind me the same way I always did. Some things you build to last. That means building them right, even when right is harder than the alternative, especially then. Helping someone isn't the same as removing every consequence they earned. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do for a person is let the weight of their own choices land exactly where it belongs on them. A house built right doesn't apologize for still standing, neither do the people who built it.